The letter fell from the book at 14 minutes past 4, though no one in Lady Kenmore's drawing room was watching the clock. Leopold Cathcart, Duke of Langmere, had been turning pages without reading them, a habit his fiancée had learned to overlook and his hostess had learned to forgive, when the folded sheet slipped from between the leaves of Cowper's poems and landed, face upward, on the carpet beside his chair. Lady Dorothea Fanshawe was the nearest. She was always the nearest to him in any room. It was one of the qualities that had made her such an obvious match, this talent for proximity without effort, for occupying exactly the right space with exactly the right grace. She bent and retrieved the letter before he could reach for it, and she did so with a smile, as though rescuing a dropped glove. "You are using correspondence as a bookmark," she said, turning it over. "How unlike you. I thought you kept everything in that dreadful bureau of yours." She said it lightly. She was always light. It was what the ton admired most about her, the effortless polish, the ability to make any observation sound like an invitation to laugh. Across the room, Mrs. Kenmore smiled into her tea. Ruth Haddon, seated beside the window, glanced up from her needlework, and Jessamine Brooke, who had been reading quietly in the far corner where companions were expected to sit, did not look up at all. "The handwriting," Lady Dorothea said, unfolding it part way. Not reading. She would not read another's letter. She had too much breeding for that, but studying the script itself, the way one might study an unfamiliar watercolor. How earnest. Look at this. Every letter formed as though the writer believed penmanship were a moral obligation. She held it up, angled toward Mrs. Kenmore. "Is this not the most careful hand you have ever seen? One imagines the writer pressing so hard the nib nearly broke. All that feeling pushed into the page. She was not being cruel. That was what made it precise in its devastation. She was being observant, even admiring in a distant way, as one might admire the determination of a child learning to paint. She genuinely did not know whose hand it was." Leopold had not moved. His teacup was in his right hand, raised an inch above the saucer, and it had not traveled the remaining distance to his mouth. His left hand was still open where the book had been, fingers slightly curled, as though the volume had dissolved and left behind only the shape of holding. He was looking at the letter in Dorothea's hand with an expression that no one in the room could read, because no one in the room had seen it before. Jessamine Brooke turned a page of her book. The sound was very small, the whisper of paper against paper, and it should not have been audible beneath Dorothea's voice and the clink of Mrs. Kenmore's spoon against her saucer and the distant sound of a gardener's shears beyond the open window. But Leopold heard it. He heard it the way a man hears a church bell in a city he thought he had left behind, not with surprise, but with the sudden unbearable recognition that he had never stopped listening for it. He set down his teacup. The porcelain touched the saucer without a sound, which meant his hand was perfectly steady, which meant he was controlling it with effort. "May I have that back?" he said. Not a question, not sharp, flat, the way a man speaks when the words are serving as a door pulled shut over something behind them. Dorothea looked at him. Her smile did not falter. She was too accomplished for that, but something behind her eyes shifted, the way light shifts behind curtains when a cloud passes. She held the letter out. He took it. He folded it along its original creases, and Jessamine, from the far corner where she was not watching, could have told anyone who asked that he folded it exactly right, because he knew the creases, because he had folded and unfolded that letter many times before, in rooms where no one could see him do it. The conversation recovered. Lady Dorothea said something about the weather. Mrs. Kenmore poured more tea. Ruth Haddon bent over her needlework and pulled a thread so tight it snapped, which she did not notice because she was watching Jessamine's face, which had not changed at all, which was exactly how Ruth knew that everything had changed entirely. The letters had begun 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1811, when Jessamine Brooke was 20 and Leopold Cathcart was not yet a duke. He had been the Marquis of Langmere then, the elder son, expected to inherit but not yet burdened with it. He had come to the village of Arden Cross to inspect a property his father had purchased, a minor estate, barely worth the name, with a leaking roof and an orchard that had not been pruned in a decade. The Reverend Brooks rectory bordered the property on its southern edge, separated by a low stone wall and a line of hawthorn that flowered white in May. Jessamine had been reading in the rectory garden when the Marquis walked the boundary with his surveyor. She had not looked up. He had noticed that she had not looked up, which was unusual. Most people looked up when a Marquis walked past, and he had noticed what she was reading, which was Plutarch. in translation, with a pencil tucked behind her ear for marginalia. He had said nothing to her that day. He had returned the following week on the pretext of reviewing the surveyor's drawings, and the Reverend had invited him to dinner, and Jessamine had sat across the table and asked him whether the orchard might be saved, and if so, whether he intended to keep the Bramleys or replant with something less temperamental. She had spoken to him about apple trees as though apple trees were worthy of a marquess's attention. He had found, walking back to his carriage afterwards, that he could not remember what else had been discussed. The letters had started because of the orchard. She had written to tell him that the man he had hired to assess the trees was, in her father's opinion, an optimist of the most dangerous variety, and that if the Marquis wished for an honest account of the root damage, he might consult Mr. Gosse, who had managed the Tewkesbury orchards for 40 years and owed nothing to anyone. Leopold had written back, a brief correct note of thanks. She had replied with a report so thorough, so detailed, so unexpectedly dry in its humor, that he had read it twice in his study and then put it in the top drawer of his desk, beneath a folio of estate maps where no one would find it. The letters had continued. Through the winter of 1811, through the spring of 1812 when his father fell ill, through the summer when the old Duke died and Leopold became Langmere, in fact, rather than expectation, through the autumn when the weight of the title settled onto his shoulders like a coat cut for someone else's frame. Jessamine wrote about the village, the orchard, the weather, her father's sermons, the fox that had taken to sleeping beneath the church porch. She wrote about books she had read and opinions she held and questions she could not answer. She wrote without deference, without performance, without any consciousness that she was addressing a duke, because when they had begun, he had not been one, and she had never adjusted her tone, and he had never wanted her to. He had kept every letter. He did not know when the keeping had become deliberate, when it had shifted from absent accumulation to something he did with intention, stacking them in order, tying them with a length of plain brown ribbon he had taken from a legal packet, because he could not bring himself to use anything finer, anything that would make the keeping look like what it was. The letters had stopped in the spring of 1813. They had stopped because Leopold had become engaged to Lady Dorothea Fanshawe, and because Jessamine Brooke had the kind of pride that did not bend but simply ceased. She did not write a final letter. She did not write to congratulate him. She simply stopped, the way a musician stops when the room is emptied and there is no one left to hear. He had noticed. He had noticed immediately, the absence arriving in his morning post like a gap in a row of teeth, obvious and irreversible. He had told himself it was correct. He had told himself she understood, as he did, that the correspondence had been irregular, that it could not continue alongside an engagement to a woman of Dorothea's standing, that it had been— What had it been? He could not finish the sentence, even to himself. He had put the last letter she had written, an account of a late frost that had damaged the rectory garden, written with the kind of resigned precision that made him hear her voice in every syllable, inside a volume of Cowper's poems, between pages 114 and 115, where the poem about solitude gave way to the poem about evening. He had carried that book to London. Now Jessamine sat in Lady Kenmore's drawing room, because she was Lady Kenmore's companion, a position she had taken 6 months ago when her father died and the living passed to a new rector, and the rectory was no longer hers. She read. She managed correspondence. She accompanied Lady Kenmore to social engagements and sat in corners and was introduced, when she was introduced at all, as Miss Brooke, who is invaluable to me. She did not look at Leopold when they were in the same room. She did not avoid looking at him either. She simply directed her attention elsewhere with the practiced discipline of a woman who had decided once cleanly and did not revisit decisions. He had not known she was in London until 3 weeks ago, when he had walked into Lady Kenmore's music room for a small evening gathering and seen her standing beside the pianoforte, turning pages for a girl who was murdering a Handel sonata. He had stopped in the doorway. Dorothea had taken his arm and drawn him forward, and he had gone, because that was what one did. One went forward, but something in the architecture of his evening had shifted. Some wall he had not known he was leaning against had moved 6 inches to the left, and he had spent the rest of the night standing at a slightly wrong angle to everything. The tea party ended at 5:30. Lady Dorothea departed in her family's carriage, pressing Leopold's hand and reminding him of the Ashford dinner on Thursday. Mrs. Kenmore excused herself to speak with her cook about a supper arrangement. Ruth Haddon gathered her needlework and gave Jessamine a look so weighted with meaning that it could have served as ballast for a merchant vessel. Leopold stood in the entrance hall with his gloves in one hand and his hat in the other, and the book of Cowper's poems under his arm with the letter inside it, and he did not leave. Jessamine was crossing the hall toward the service stair when he spoke. "Miss Brooke." She stopped. She turned. She looked at him with an expression of polite attention that was so perfectly calibrated it could have been used to tune an instrument. "Your Grace, you heard what she said about the letter." It was not a question, and Jessamine did not treat it as one. She stood with her hands folded and her back straight, and the late afternoon light from the fanlight above the door falling across her face, and she waited because she had learned, in drawing rooms and dining rooms and all the small humiliations of life as a companion, that waiting was the only currency a woman in her position could spend. "It was your handwriting," he said. She did not know. "No, you said nothing." "There was nothing to say, Your Grace. Lady Dorothea made an observation about penmanship. She was not wrong. My hand is plain. I was taught by my father, who valued clarity over ornament." She called it earnest. "It is earnest. That is not an error." He looked at her. The hall was empty. The light through the fanlight made a half-moon shape on the marble floor between them, and neither of them stepped into it. "I have kept every letter you wrote me," he said. She did not move. She did not draw a breath or shift her weight or allow anything in her expression to change, but something happened behind her eyes. A door opened and closed so quickly that only a man who had been watching that particular door for 3 years would have seen it. "That is your concern," she said, "and not mine." She turned and walked toward the service stair, and her steps were even, and her posture was straight, and she did not look back. Leopold stood in the hall with the book under his arm and the gloves crushed in his fist and watched her go, and he understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives like a physical blow, sudden and total and impossible to mistake for anything else, that he had been a fool of the most dangerous variety, the kind who keeps the evidence of what he wants and never acts upon it. He did not go to the Ashford dinner on Thursday. He sent a note to Dorothea that evening, not long, not unkind, asking if he might call on her the following morning at 11. She would have known reading it that something was wrong. Dorothea was not a woman who missed signals. She was, in fact, a woman of considerable intelligence, which was part of what made the cruelty of the situation so precise. She had done nothing wrong. She had mocked a stranger's handwriting at tea. She had not known. She could not have known. He arrived at the Fanshawe house at 11. He was shown into the morning room, where Dorothea was waiting in a chair by the window with her hands in her lap, and her face composed into an expression that told him she had already understood. "You are going to withdraw," she said before he had finished his bow. "Yes?" "May I ask why?" He told her. Not everything, not the letters, not the 3 years of folding and refolding, not the sound of a page turning in a drawing room, but enough. He told her there was a prior attachment he had not honored, and that continuing the engagement would be a dishonesty he could not sustain. He told her she deserved a man whose attention was not divided, and that he was sorry, and that the fault was entirely his. Dorothea listened. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment with an expression he would remember for years. Not anger, not hurt, but something cooler and more precise, a woman taking accurate measurements of a man and finding him smaller than she had estimated. "The handwriting," she said. "At Lady Kenmore's, the letter in the book." "Yes." She nodded once. "I mocked it," she said, "at tea, while she was sitting in the room. You did not know." "No, but you did. You knew the moment I picked it up, and you said nothing, and you let me continue." She stood. "That is the part I will not forgive, Your Grace. Not the attachment, the silence. You let me make myself foolish in front of a woman you preferred to me, and you did not even have the courtesy to stop me." She was right. He knew she was right. He bowed and left, and behind him, Dorothea Fanshawe sat down in the chair by the window and permitted herself 5 minutes of fury before she rang for tea and began composing the letters that would manage the dissolution with the efficiency for which she was justly admired. The tongue would talk. The tongue always talked. But Dorothea handled it with such skill that the story which circulated was merely that the Duke of Langmere and Lady Dorothea had discovered an incompatibility of temperament, regrettable, but these things happen, and that the parting had been mutual and without rancor. It was not true, but it was survivable, and Dorothea was, above all else, a woman who survived. Leopold did not go to Jessamine immediately. He understood, because the letters had taught him to understand her, even when he had refused to act on that understanding, that she would not accept him on the heels of a broken engagement. She would see it as aftermath. She would see herself as the destination a man reaches when his first road closes, and her pride, which was quiet and structural and fundamental to everything she was, would not allow it. He waited 4 weeks. During those weeks he did things that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like acts of honest intention. He wrote to the steward at Langmere Park, Stannard, who had managed the estate since his father's time, and asked for a full accounting of the Arden Cross property, the one with the orchard, the one that bordered the rectory where Jessamine had grown up. He asked specifically about the Bramleys. Stannard's reply, arriving by express, contained the information that the orchard had been saved, that Mr. Goss, recommended Stannard noted by the late Reverend Brooke's daughter, had overseen the restoration, and that the trees had fruited well for 2 consecutive autumns. He carried that letter in his coat pocket for 3 days before he called on Lady Kenmore. Thus, Pickford, his own housekeeper at the London house, had observed the change without comment. She was not a woman who offered opinions unsolicited, but she noticed, as housekeepers do, that his Grace had stopped sleeping through breakfast, that he was reading his correspondence with attention rather than passing it to his secretary, and that a volume of Cowper's poems had migrated from the study to the bedside table and was being handled with a frequency that suggested it contained something other than poetry. He called on Lady Kenmore on a Tuesday morning at an hour when companions were expected to be present and available and visible in the way that suited the household's rhythms. Lady Kenmore received him in the drawing-room, the same room where the tea had taken place, though the chairs had been rearranged and the light was different, slanting through the east windows in long gold bars that fell across the carpet like the lines of a musical staff. Jessamine was there. She was writing letters at a small desk near the bookcase, Lady Kenmore's correspondence, not her own, and she rose when he entered and curtsied, and stood with her pen still in her hand and a drop of ink darkening the side of her index finger. "Miss Brooke," Lady Kenmore said, "the Duke wishes to speak with you. I shall be in the morning room if you need me." She left with the particular expression of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this outcome and intends to take full credit for it later. The room was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. A carriage passed in the street below, the sound of hooves on cobblestones rising and falling like a wave. "I've come to return something," Leopold said. He reached into his coat and took out a letter. Not the letter from the book, but a different one, the first one she had ever written to him, the one about the orchard and the optimistic assessor and Mr. Goss. He held it out, and she looked at it, and she did not take it. "I do not want it back," she said. "I know. But I want you to see that I have it, that I have had it, that I have had all of them, every letter, in order, tied with brown ribbon in the top drawer of my desk at Langmere, beneath the estate maps where I put them, because I did not want anyone to find them, and because I could not bring myself to put them anywhere I would not know exactly where they were." Jessamine set down her pen. The drop of ink on her finger had dried to a small dark spot like a period at the end of a sentence. "You were engaged," she said. "For 8 months. You carried my letters, and you were engaged to another woman, and you did not write to me, and you did not call on me, and you did not—" She stopped. She breathed. When she spoke again, her voice was level. "You kept the evidence, Your Grace, but you did not act on it. Keeping is not the same as choosing." "No," he said, "it is not." "Then what are you choosing now?" "You. I am choosing you. I should have chosen you when I read the letter about the frost in your father's garden and realized I could hear your voice in every line. I should have chosen you when I came to London and saw you turning pages at the pianoforte and could not remember for 30 seconds how to breathe. I should have chosen you 3 years ago when the first letter arrived and I put it in a drawer instead of putting it in my pocket and walking to Arden Cross and telling your father that his daughter had written me 600 words about apple trees and I intended to marry her for it." "That would have been excessive," Jessamine said, but her voice was not steady, and her hands, folded now over the ink-stained finger, were holding each other too tightly for composure. "It would have been honest. I have not been honest. I have been careful, correct. I have done what was expected and kept what I wanted hidden in a drawer, and I am asking you now whether it is too late." She looked at him. The light from the east window was in her eyes, turning them amber at the edges, and he thought of every letter she had written, The handwriting Lady Dorothea had called plain the sentences that were not plain at all, that were layered and precise and full of the kind of attention that most people never learn to pay. "It is not too late," she said, "but it will be done properly. You will court me as you should have done. You will call on Lady Kenmore, and you will sit in this drawing-room, and you will drink tea you do not want and make conversation you do not need, because that is what is owed. Not to society, to me. You owed me the ordinary way of things, and you skipped it, and I will have it now." "Yes," he said. "And you will not carry my letters in books of poetry as though they are secrets. They were not secrets. They were letters, written plainly, to a man I believed was paying attention. I was paying attention. You were paying attention and doing nothing. That is worse." He could not argue with this. He did not try. He stood in Lady Kenmore's drawing-room, with the first letter still in his hand, and the morning light falling between them, and he nodded, and he left, and he came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and every Tuesday for 2 months, sitting in the same chair and drinking tea from the same cup, and talking to Jessamine Brooke about books and weather and the Langmere orchard, which she asked about with the same direct, unsentimental interest she had shown in her very first letter, as though 3 years and an engagement and a silence had not intervened, as though they were simply picking up a conversation that had been paused, not broken. During those Tuesdays, he learned things the letters had not told him. He learned that she took her tea without sugar, because her father had considered sweetness in hot drinks a minor indulgence, and she had never corrected the habit. He learned that she read standing up when she was truly interested and sitting down when she was being polite. He learned that she had a way of pausing before she answered a question, not hesitating but weighing, that made him want to wait for every word she had ever considered and discarded before arriving at the one she chose. She learned things about him, too, though she was less surprised by them. She had always suspected from the letters he wrote back, shorter than hers, less fluent, but careful in their own way, that he was a man who felt things at a delay, the way thunder arrives after lightning, and that the feeling, when it came, was no less real for being late. On the 5th Tuesday, she showed him a passage in a book she was reading, a history of English horticulture, and their hands touched over the page, and neither of them moved, and the clock ticked 11 times before Ruth Haddon coughed from the window seat with the pointed discretion of a woman who understood exactly what she was witnessing and intended to pretend she had not. Lady Kenmore presided over these visits with visible satisfaction. Ruth Haddon attended as chaperone and occupied herself with needlework so aggressively productive that she completed an entire fire screen in the span of the courtship. Mrs. Pickford, at the London house, noted that His Grace's Tuesday mornings were now sacrosanct and adjusted the household schedule without being asked. He proposed on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, because Jessamine had mentioned in passing that she disliked predictability, and he had understood this for the instruction it was. He proposed in the rectory garden at Arden Cross, where the hawthorn was flowering white along the boundary wall, and the orchard beyond it was heavy with fruit. He proposed simply, without speeches, because she was not a woman who required performance, and because the truest thing he could say was the shortest. "I should like to spend the rest of my life paying attention," he said, "if you will let me." "That's a great deal of attention," she said. "Yes?" She looked at the orchard. The Bramleys were coming in well. Mr. Goss's work, or her recommendation, the first letter she had ever written to him bearing fruit in the most literal sense. "Then yes," she said, and he took her hand, the one with the ink stain that never quite faded from her index finger, the hand that had written every letter he had ever kept. And they stood in the garden where they had begun, and did not speak for several minutes, because some things, once said, need only silence after them. The wedding was held in the chapel at Langmere Park in September, when the orchard was at its heaviest, and the morning light came through the east windows, in the same gold bars that had fallen across Lady Kenmore's drawing-room on the day he had returned the first letter. Jessamine wore ivory muslin with a high empire waist and a spencer of pale blue silk, and she carried no flowers because she had told Mrs. Pickford, who had asked tentatively about arrangements, that she did not see the point of carrying something that would be dead by evening. On the morning of the wedding, before the chapel, before the breakfast, before any of it, Jessamine found a box on the writing desk in her dressing room. It was plain, no gilt, no engraving, just polished walnut with brass hinges. Inside, tied with brown ribbon, the same brown ribbon, she realized, taken from a legal packet, slightly frayed at the edges from handling, were her letters, all of them. She counted, 37. Every letter she had written to him between the autumn of 1811 and the spring of 1813. In order, each one folded along its original creases, each one bearing the small, soft evidence of having been read more than once. Beneath the last letter was a note in his hand, and his handwriting, she thought, was not plain at all. It was the handwriting of a man who had been taught by tutors and had somewhere along the way started forming his letters with more care than was fashionable, as though legibility were a form of respect. The note said, "These are yours. They have always been yours. I was only keeping them until I was brave enough to say so." She put the note inside the box and closed the lid and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the walnut surface, and then she stood and dressed and went to the chapel and married him. And she did not weep, because weeping would have been imprecise, and Jessamine Brooke, Jessamine Cathcart, Duchess of Langmere, was not an imprecise woman. Leopold took his seat in the House of Lords that autumn, traveling to London for the session, while Jessamine remained at Langmere Park, where she had already begun a correspondence with Stannard about the south pasture drainage, and a separate correspondence with Mr. Gosse about extending the orchard. She wrote to Leopold every week, the same plain hand, the same direct voice, the same attention to the things that mattered, the estate, the tenants, the foxes beneath the church porch, the light in the library at 4 o'clock on November afternoons. He kept every letter. He did not hide them in drawers or slip them between pages of poetry. He kept them on his desk in a wooden tray where anyone who entered his study could see them. When colleagues in the house inquired about the Duchess, he said she was well and that she wrote to him regularly, and the way he said it, plainly without performance, made several men who had not thought about their own correspondence in years go home and write to their wives. Dorothea Fanshawe married a viscount the following spring, a man of good humor and modest ambition who admired her intelligence without feeling diminished by it. She did not speak of Leopold, and when she encountered Jessamine at a reception 2 years later, she inclined her head with a courtesy so precise it could only have come from a woman who had decided, once, cleanly, to be generous, and who did not revisit decisions. Their first child, a daughter, was born the following autumn. Leopold was at Langmere for the birth. He had refused to travel to London despite the session, and when Mrs. Pickford brought the news that the Duchess and the child were well, he went to the study and sat at his desk and wrote a single line on a sheet of paper, and folded it, and walked upstairs and placed it on the pillow beside Jessamine's head, where she lay with the baby asleep against her chest. She unfolded it with one hand, the other curved around the child, and read, 38. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the bedchamber with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way she had never seen it open before. Not guarded, not careful, not correct, just open, like a letter unfolded for the first time. "You're counting my letters," she said. "I am counting everything you have given me," he said. "The letters are simply where I started." The walnut box sat on the writing desk in the Duchess's rooms at Langmere Park for the rest of their lives, growing slowly fuller, the brown ribbon replaced once, and only once, when the original finally frayed through from years of tying and untying. The replacement ribbon was also brown, also plain, also taken from a legal packet. Some things do not need to be ornamental to be kept. They arrive here, like handwriting recognized across a room, whenever they're ready.